All right, back on a conversation. We've got a fun, explosive topic for you guys: Russian interference. Whenever we talk about that, everybody gets animated. Let's put it that way online. Joining us is David Scheimer. He wrote the book "Rigged: America, Russia, and the 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference." And if you're wondering if that's by America or by Russia, the answer is both. The book is mainly focused on Russia, though. So, David, welcome to the program. And obviously, not only an explosive topic, but one that's very relevant as we've got elections coming up in 4 months. I want to start with the idea that the Russians might have been able to interfere with the actual voting in 2016, which leads me to wonder if they could do it in 2020. So, what are the facts behind that as far as we know them now?
I think that's definitely something that we need to watch out for in 2020. I was struck in my research for my book how vulnerable our voting systems were in the summer and fall of 2016, to the point where that exposure captivated the Obama administration. Russian military intelligence was able to probe, scan, and penetrate election systems across the United States. Michael Daniel, the White House cybersecurity coordinator, told me that he was getting daily reports of Russian intrusions into our voting systems. And this exposure was so present that on election day itself, as I reveal in my book, the White House and the Department of Homeland Security were running secret crisis teams bracing for a Russian cyber attack to either alter voter data or alter actual vote tallies, which, according to officials like John Brennan and Jay Johnson, Russia had the ability to do. So for whatever reason, based on the available evidence, Russia did not actually execute upon that ability in 2016. But given that we now have a president who has solicited rather than sought to deter, as President Obama did, foreign electoral interference, I am worried that Russia's calculus may have shifted over the last 4 years.
So, I don't know if it's revealed in the book or if it's classified. Some folks will look at it, David, as, hey, that's fear mongering. Could they really break into and change the vote tabulations? Some folks will find that outlandish. But what are they saying on the record? Did they believe that they definitely had the capability to do that in 2016?
I think the best way to sort of address that skepticism is just to look at the facts. I interviewed 26 former senior advisors to President Obama, and what I found is that their captivation was the exposure of our voting systems. That is why President Obama issued a warning to Vladimir Putin, brought congressional leaders together to issue a statement about the exposure of our voting systems, had Jay Johnson consider issuing a critical infrastructure designation. Even a few days before the election, the White House cybersecurity coordinator told me that he sent a warning to his Russian counterpart requesting that they cease their scans and intrusions into our voter registration databases. And again, the crisis teams were operating on election day itself, and officials like John Brennan, the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor Amy Pope, Jay Johnson told me that what seemed very plausible and very possible was that Russia would disrupt the actual voting process. And I analyzed that, and what that also reveals is why President Obama made the decisions he did, because he actually waited to retaliate against Russia for another form of electoral interference, which is to manipulate people, as Russia did across social media and with hacked emails, until after Election Day, out of the fear that by hitting Putin before Election Day, Putin might actually respond by escalating his operation toward disrupting the actual voting process, as he had done, by the way, in countries like Ukraine in 2014. So this was a real possibility that ultimately froze the administration in those fateful months of the summer and fall because of what Russia had the ability to do.
So, David, you write about how at the federal level, there actually wasn't much the Obama administration could do to help safeguard the vote in different states, because that's not how our system works. The states handle that. And so, to your knowledge, has there been any safeguards put into place in those different states to prevent an attack on the actual vote tabulation from Russia or anyone else?
I would say by no means sufficiently. I think the Department of Homeland Security, as has been publicly reported, is seeking to offer assistance to states as it did during 2016. But the Congress has not passed cybersecurity standards for states on a mandatory basis, which means that states who would like to refuse federal assistance can still do so. And so as a result, because of the decentralized nature of our election system, even if, say, this is just a hypothetical, Pennsylvania cooperates with the federal government and really shores up its defenses, another state like Georgia can say, I don't want you anywhere near my systems. And until the Congress steps in to resolve that inconsistency, our system will remain inconsistent and inconsistent in its security structure. And I do worry that both because, as I said, the current occupant of the White House has invited foreign interference, but also the coronavirus has built in a pre-existing level of doubt around the sanctity of the voting process. And the Russian tradition is to take advantage of pre-existing vulnerabilities. So it would take very little effort on the part of Russian cyber actors to delegitimize the sanctity of the election, to convince Americans that the vote was not actually stable by, for example, just causing chaos, say, at some polling places, by maybe scrambling voter registration databases, which, again, President Obama's senior most advisors on the record say in my book that Russia had the capability to do 4 years ago.
So we know Mitch McConnell did not put those safeguards into place. We know that if Russia or any other country interferes on behalf of Donald Trump, there will be no investigation. They'll cover it up instantly. So there's a potential disaster in the making. By the way, it's entirely possible. And I've said 1,000 times over the last decade, these local yokels in the States, they don't know anything. So the idea that they could prevent an attack from Russia or China or India or anywhere else is preposterous. They couldn't begin to compete with those guys. And of course, we should have national cybersecurity to protect our vote. And we just don't. So God knows what will happen on election day. Anything could happen.
Sure, and I think I'd add two important points there. One is that we both have to focus on the prospect of an election day cyber attack, but we also have to be mindful between now and election day of how Russia will seek to manipulate voters, because both forms of attack matter. How Russia seeks to manipulate public opinion, and also whether Russia seeks to escalate toward disrupting the actual voting process. The second thing Americans need to keep in mind is what Russia is after. This is a mission to degrade, discredit, and delegitimize the democratic model, to corrupt our process of succession so as to take away the sense of a future in our society, to inhibit progress, to promote dysfunction so as to corrupt our democracy itself, which is part of a global mission of Putin's Russia, because right now this is not just happening in America. I interviewed the president of Montenegro, the former president of Colombia, both of whom are under siege by Russian actors who are seeking to discredit again and corrupt their elections as a mean of transforming their democratic systems themselves. So this is part of a global strategy, and America is a part of that story, and we need to recognize it as such.
Well, so David, that leads to a couple of questions. One is, when it comes to just influence, I don't know what could be done about it, and so I'm curious your take on that, and especially given that we don't have the moral high ground. We've interfered in 1,000 elections, and so to say that Russia's trying to influence elections, well, of course they are. Anyone who thinks they're not is being incredibly naive. But we do similar actions, to say the least, let alone killing people we don't like and committing coups. That doesn't mean that we should be hands off about Russia doing it to us. But what's your take on what we can do to limit their influence, given that it is a free country and they could send people in to say whatever they want?
Sure, and I do want to sort of clarify for viewers, I worked very hard to get at the current nature of American policymaking. I interviewed more than 130 people, 8 former CIA directors, many foreign officials, and what I found is that American policymaking has evolved. Whereas the CIA interfered in many elections during the Cold War, we have moved away from that practice, that covert practice in the post-Cold War period, with the rare exceptions that I do detail in the book. But in terms of what can be done, yes, we cannot stop Russia from manipulating voters covertly. The penetrability of elections is endemic to the democratic model. Vladimir Lenin saw that. Vladimir Putin sees that. Soviet and now Russian leaders have been targeting American elections for a century. The KGB targeted American elections throughout the Cold War, by the way, to hurt Republican candidates, because this is a national threat. It's not a political threat. But moving forward, we can manage this. We can mitigate the effectiveness of this through efforts by the citizenry to be aware, by the media not to be played, by social media companies to look out for foreign malign behavior, by Congress to step in and install measures that would help defend our elections, and by the president, obviously not this president, but moving forward, to lead a coherent national policy to secure our elections at home and to defend our elections and deter this sort of behavior abroad. And I argue that we need a strategy of renewal to directly answer Russia's strategy of tearing down our democracy.
The one thing I'm positive of is that the social media companies need to do a way better job of rooting out bots and fake pages and fake tweets. I know Twitter on some grounds is trying harder than Facebook, but the bots and trolls on Twitter are just absolutely out of control and so easy to manipulate. So the more needs to be done on that count, no question about it.
Absolutely. And I would just say, too, Americans I really feel strongly need to be aware. I spent 4 hours interviewing a former KGB general. And what he told me is that Soviet intelligence, now Russian intelligence, their mission is to direct our process of succession by corrupting propaganda channels like social media platforms today or like newspapers a generation ago. We need to be on guard for that, and we need to protect ourselves against that, because this is about the sovereignty of our democracy, regardless of political party. This is an issue that all Americans should be invested in, because if foreigners can choose our leaders, then we will not have a functioning democracy.
All right, David, I just got to challenge you on America not being as involved in elections anymore.
Please.
You talked to 8 CIA directors. They told you that the CIA doesn't do it, to which I say, of course, that's what they told you. But we see the coup that we just tried in Venezuela, where there was a coup in Bolivia. The coups appear to go on unabated.
So I can't comment on that. What I research is election operations, not coup plotting. Those are two separate forms of covert action. But what I would say to your point about CIA directors is the art of reporting is getting as many perspectives as possible on background, off the record, on the record. I didn't just interview 8 former CIA directors. I interviewed many, many more CIA officers, many, many more national security officials. And I actually revealed a covert operation that the CIA executed to interfere in an election in 2000 that hadn't previously been on the public record. And I got Bill Clinton. I interviewed him, and he recognized that he did authorize that operation in our interview in order to work against the tyrant Slobodan Milosevic. So I worked my hardest to get at what CIA policy is today. I map out the case as to why what I say we've moved away from electoral operations is true, in terms of our not wanting to undermine ourselves in doing so, and recognizing that if we're caught, it would broadcast American hypocrisy to the world. So am I saying that the CIA doesn't do this at all? I don't think that's credible. Do I think the CIA is doing this as frequently as Russian intelligence with the same objectives and the same means? I don't think that matches up to reality. And I think folks who think that is true should I hope, examine chapter 6 of my book, because I really go through the history of this in a way that has not been done before, as to what the CIA did a generation ago, what the CIA does today, and how that aligns with the evolution of American foreign policy making in general.
Yeah, I hear you. And yes, they admitted to
come on.
interfering. I'm not buying it, to be honest. They admitted to interfering in an election, opposing a tyrant. Ooh, what an admission! Did we not try to help Ahmed Chalabi win the Iraqi elections? Is Ahmed Chalabi not a CIA asset? Come on.
So I actually go through in the book debates within the agency and within the Bush administration over whether to interfere in the Iraqi election with the covert action program in 2005, and the actual decision not to do that. And I have 6 officials on the record about that debate and why they pulled back. So again, is this something the CIA doesn't do at all? I don't think that's true. Leon Panetta, for example, in the book describes programs he oversaw in 2009, 10, and 11 as CIA director to influence foreign media. My argument is that there's been a divergence in American and Russian foreign policy making, whereas the KGB and CIA were in this game with the same intensity as they were during the Cold War. There's been a divergence now as Putin is targeting, again, elections and democracies all over the world by spreading disinformation across social media, by stealing and releasing sensitive documents, by targeting voting systems, as in America and elsewhere, in order to tear down democratic systems. So I do not believe there is an equivalency here, but between America and Russia. But I do think we should learn from the CIA's history, which is why I go into great detail as to how both Soviet, Russian, and CIA have sought to interfere in elections around the world over the last 100 years in my book.
Yeah, and look, I don't want anybody to be naive on either side. So there's some folks who now think the CIA interferes in elections, but those poor Russians and poor Vladimir Putin, they would never. And that is hilarious. Putin is not a fan of democracy, to say the least, and certainly not a fan of us. And so, can they do that? Absolutely. Am I worried about it in 20? If you're not worried about it in 2020, you're not paying attention. There's no way in the world that those state governments have people who can counteract hackers like the Russians and other countries have. There's no way. So God knows what's going to happen in 2020. And the Republicans, we've lost them as maybe the other people in media would find it controversial. I don't find it at all controversial. McConnell and Trump would be ecstatic if a foreign country rigged the election on behalf of the Republican Party. So they're never going to do anything about it. Never.
Sorry, and I know that at just one point, and I agree, and three of President Trump's advisors said to me in my book that they actually think Donald Trump wants Russia to interfere in our election. And the last thing is, I'll just say, as we prepare for that attack, my book maps out the history of these operations going back again 100 years, because what I reveal is that there are patterns, there are lessons in these stories and CIA, KGB, Russian operations to interfere in elections that should and can instruct how we as citizens defend our own elections, our own sovereignty moving forward. And at our own peril, we ignore those lessons and just pretend like this has never happened before, because it has. 2016 was just an evolution of a long-running practice, and 2020 is shaping up to be that next chapter. But this is a very old story, and I really believe strongly that there's much to be learned from it.
All right, David Scheimer, the book is Rigged, America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference. Everybody check it out. Obviously an interesting read. David, thank you for joining us on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.